Greetings from beautiful Norway. My name's Paul, and today I'd just like to present just some basics on preparation and how to get started and the things that are important to consider. For my Norwegian viewers, god dag folkens, jeg må beklage, men jeg skal snakke på engelsk fordi jeg også deler den informasjonen på forskjellige andre kanaler. Så jeg prøver å snakke litt saktere, så det er litt lettere for folk til å forstå hva det er jeg snakker om. So, just before we get started, I'd just like to introduce myself and my background and what kind of got me started into prepping in the first place. I was born and raised in Australia, and I've been through bushfires and floods with my family. We lived out in the bush and we were quite self-sufficient. We had a farm where we produced much of our own produce and our own food, and we were very, very self-sufficient. We really didn't have to rely on many people for what it was that we needed. Now, I didn't realize until later on in life when I became a professional firefighter that this skill that I had developed with my family members, that this was actually quite a valuable skill. And in these unstable times that we're living in now, we see that those people who can take care of themselves, they are actually quite valuable in the prepper community. So I'd like to share those things that I've learned with you guys, and I'll be putting videos together every week and I'll be presenting them to you. And these are from a perspective of a non-military style prepper, and more of a civilian type prepper. So that's a little bit about myself. Now, I do live in Norway, so the situation may vary depending on where you are, because of course preparation is also very dependent on the situation and the place where you're living. So first of all, let's have a look at what the immediate needs are when you're in an emergency situation. And a lot of times there'll be a top 10 list, or people will say, in order of priority, what are the things that are most important? And I don't really like to look at it that way, because certain things are equally important. So this is just a list of very, very important things that are required in an immediate emergency situation. One of the most critical things is, of course, first aid. If you're losing blood, or if you've got a severe injury and you're going into shock, one of the first things that you need to do is to manage your own health. So you need to make sure that you and everyone around you are safe first and foremost, and that is the most immediate need that you have. So make sure that you've always got some first aid items on hand. The second thing I kind of lump together, and I combine a few different things in with shelter. So there's shelter, sanitation, heat, and light. Now, it may sound a little bit strange to lump these in together, but where you're living, generally you want it to be clean, otherwise it's going to introduce sickness and illness. You want it to be warm, otherwise you can die from hypothermia, especially in the north here where we're living in Norway. And you want there to be light, because if you're dependent on sunlight to get all your work done, there's not going to be enough hours in the day, especially if you're living in the north where we are, and the days are quite short. So you need good quality lighting. So there's first aid, then there is your shelter, sanitation, heat, and light. And in sanitation, I include things like your toilet paper, your soaps, for women, sanitary pads, all of these types of items that are important for making sure that you keep yourself clean and things are hygienic. Then we have to have a look at water. Now, there are a number of different things to consider when you're thinking about water. One is how you're going to purify it, and the other one is, once you purify it, how are you going to store it once you can verify that it's clean and drinkable. So you should have a dirty water storage and a clean water storage, and you should also have a very practical way of transporting water. Now, for you people living in the city, you have a challenge, because if the pumps stop, if the electricity is cut out, how are you going to get water up into your apartment? The person at the bottom will have water because they can turn their tap on and they'll get the water all the way to the bottom because it'll be gravity fed. But you people at the top living in the higher apartments, you'll be the first ones to run out of water. So how are you going to make sure that you have water? And this is an important topic, and I'm going to cover that in a later video. After water then, I have food. So with food, how are you going to store your food? What type of food should you be storing? And then how are you going to prepare that food and cook it? In an emergency situation, you don't want to be cooking that food outside where everyone can see it. You don't want people to know that you even have it for the most part, because then people will be coming and they'll either be begging you for it, or they'll just come and take it by force. So you need some way to prepare this food inside your shelter in a way that people aren't going to know that you have it there. So this is extremely important. Now, a lot of people have petrol stoves or these camping stoves that require gas or petrol. This is going to be a challenge for you. What I would recommend is if you can get an alcohol stove, it is going to be much, much easier to keep it supplied. Or even a stove that uses charcoal, or even a wood fire that maybe you can cook outside on your balcony, but charcoal may also work for you well as well. Now, if you're out in the country like me, that's not a problem. We can always burn logs and sticks and twigs and things like that, and we isolate enough that people aren't going to track us down and find us. But for you guys in the apartments, you should have some way of cooking and preparing your food, boiling your water, where you can do it indoors and it will be safe. So then after that comes a very, very important topic, which a lot of people know is important, but they don't know how to prepare, and that is your communications. Now, communications is often ignored because a lot of people think that they're going to be the lone wolf when it comes time to preparing, and they think that they're going to survive on their own. What I've learned in the emergency services and attending a lot of not just drills but actual exercises in flood environments and bushfires or forest fires is that no man is an island. Communities have to depend on one another. But in general, the more dependent a community is on the state and on the government and the system, the worse it becomes when there is an emergency situation. Because when that emergency situation occurs, they have no way then of actually being able to get the things that they need, because they're dependent on a system which is now no longer functioning. So have a look at your own life. How dependent are you on the state? If the state collapsed tomorrow, would you still be able to survive? If the answer is no, then you need to start working on independence from the state and making sure that you're more self-sufficient. After that, it is worth stressing then that if you're going to require a community to survive, then what is going to be very, very important amongst that community is the ability to communicate. Now, if the power is cut out, things like your cell phone towers, your internet, things like that are going to go down, and you're not going to be able to communicate with people within your community. Now, you don't have to go crazy with the communications. If your community are just your neighbors and people that you have locally, you can just have a cheap radio like I have here, which is a little Xiaomi radio. It has a range, its line of sight has a range of about, I don't know, we've tested this up to about, I think, 8 or 9 kilometers, and it costs hardly anything, has all basic functions that you need. It doesn't require a license as far as I'm aware, and it seems to work okay in an emergency situation. Of course, these types of devices are dependent on power. So then the question is, how are you going to power these devices for your communications? Now, you don't have to go crazy with this kind of thing. Something as simple as one of these types of solar panels, which are water resistant. This is a 28 watt solar panel. This will charge up this radio in a matter of a few hours from being completely flat to charged on a sunny day. Now, I charged up the radio from being about half full of power to completely full in about 2 hours, and it's completely overcast here today in Norway. So your communications and power are very, very important so that you can communicate within your family, within your team and community. After that comes transport. Transport is super important because one of the reasons there's an emergency in the first place is because there's no way for people to maneuver and to be able to move between different points. This is why floods, forest fires, these kind of things become a huge problem, because the logistics breaks down. When logistics breaks down, there's no food, there's no clean water. A lot of these things become a major issue. So you have to think about your transport. How will you move between the important locations that you've designated? How will you be able to gather people within your community that you've already started working with so that you'll be able to get through a tough situation? Now, these are the immediate things, and I'll go through this list again. First aid, your shelter, sanitation, heat and light. The next one is water, and remember that's purification and storage. After that is food, and remember within food you have storage of food and you also have your cooking items. And then after food, your communications and power, and after communications and power you have transport. So it doesn't just mean a car, it means sufficient fuel, and parts if you need them to get to where you're going if you happen to have a breakdown. Now, these are the immediate needs. What about the long-term needs? Well, long-term needs, if you imagine a situation, for example, what we're seeing in Ukraine, where in the Donbass area they've been at war for 8 years. Right now that war has jumped over the regional lines, and now all of Ukraine is in conflict. So they have a problem right now because they have conflict, and there is a good likelihood that the system will not be restored for another year or two. So you have to think, how long will my food stores last? So you have to have a way of producing food and having sufficient food for you and your family and your community. So things like heirloom seeds. Do you have somewhere to plant those seeds? Do you have the implements required to actually do the farming, to grow those seeds? Do you know how to do farming? Do you know how to grow vegetables and have a vegetable patch? How old are your seeds? Are they still viable? These are very, very important things, and you need to start practicing this now if you want to be prepared. After the heirloom seeds, you have to think about your protein requirements, meat harvesting items. So things like, your fishing nets, things like your pew-pews and the freedom seeds, so that you can go out and harvest a deer or rabbits. If you don't have chickens like I've got, then you have to have a way of getting those protein needs for you and your families. Once you have those things there, then you have to have a way of actually preparing the meat so it can be stored long term. There's no point shooting a deer if most of it goes to waste. Then after that, so you've got your heirloom seeds, you've got your gardening implements, you have the way of getting your meat and your protein. Then you have your tradable items. Do you have sufficient items that you can trade with other people within your community and outside of your community, that you can get the things that you need? Because we don't have everything that we need. We will have to trade with people if we want to be really well prepared. That's how the currency is working in Ukraine at the moment. People are trading with one another to get the things they need. Do you have boxes of nails? Do you have cigarette lighters? Do you have antibiotics? Do you have paracetamol that you can give to people or trade? Do you have bottles of alcohol sitting there available that you can trade with people, or tobacco? These kind of things are very important to consider. They become very valuable. Do you have tools? Do you have a drawer just with cheap pocket knives that are good quality that you can trade with people, or multi-tools, or hammer and boxes of nails and things like that? These are things that become very, very important when there are no hardware stores open. After the tradable items comes the maintenance tools and the consumables. So you're going to need things like hammers and saws and general tools like wrenches and things like that to fix mechanical things that are required when you're growing your own vegetables and having to repair the house. What about things like heavy-duty tarpaulins? If you have a hole in the roof, how are you going to fix that if you don't have access to roofing tiles? What about if the window breaks? Do you have heavy-duty plastic that you can put across and then tape it up to keep the warmth into your house and the water out of your house? These are all things that you need to consider, depending on how prepared you're planning on being. And then after the maintenance consumables comes the services. Do you have the ability to provide services, or any type of service that is valuable? What is required to offer that service to people? For example, if you have a home machine shop, do you have a generator? Do you have the diesel or fuel required to actually produce the power to run your home workshop? Oh, I'm sorry, quite a bit of wind here, so it's probably blowing into the microphone. So these are things in the long term that you have to consider. So I'll go through that list again. You have your heirloom seeds and your gardening implements. You have your meat harvesting items and your meat preservation items. You have your tradable items, things that you're planning on just storing just for trade. You have your maintenance and consumables. And then you have your services, the things that are required for you to be able to offer your services in exchange for other goods and services. Now, depending on where you are, I'm in Norway, so I don't consider the idea of defense, but you may have to consider some defense implements as well. If you're living in the city and you're planning on what people call bugging in, then you have to have a way of ensuring that you can lock the doors and keep things secure, because a lot of people who are not prepared will want the things that you have spent your time and effort preparing on. So this is just an introduction. Now, we also have a store called Norske Prepper, and we're offering and we're providing food storage kits to allow people to store their food long term. Just be sure that if you're buying your food, if you have your water, that you have the ability to store these things for a long time without them going bad. If you don't think about this, if you don't consider this, then you will store your food for mice and weevils and insects. So we will be offering these kits in our store that will allow you to be able to store your items long term and to calculate exactly what you and your family are going to need. So this is just a short introductory video to prepping, and specifically targeted more towards prepping in Norway, but I hope you found this information useful, and I'll be shooting more videos later on down the track to help you get started in being prepared.